The storm had not stopped for 3 days when the gates of Thornvale Castle opened for a stranger. Kalen Voss, Alpha King of the Thornvale Pack, was standing in the war room when one of his sentries burst through the doors, soaked and breathless. A woman had been found near the eastern border, half buried in the snow, barely breathing. She had been carried in on a makeshift stretcher, and no one knew her name. Kalen had ruled Thornvale for 10 years, ever since the war with the Ashgrave Pack had left half his territory in ashes and half his people in graves. He had learned, in those 10 years, to trust almost no one. He kept his circle small and his guard high. So when he heard that a stranger had been found at the border in the middle of a storm, his first instinct was suspicion, not concern. He walked to the healer's wing anyway. He told himself it was only to ask questions once she woke. He did not expect his wolf to react the way it did the moment he stepped through the door. The woman lay on the healer's table, pale and still, her dark hair damp against her forehead. She could not have been older than 25. Her breathing was shallow, her lips faintly blue from the cold, and there were cuts along her arms that looked deliberate, not accidental. Kalen's wolf, the part of him that rarely stirred for anything other than danger or duty, pressed forward inside his chest, alert and unwilling to look away from her. Then the healer pulled back the torn fabric at her shoulder to clean a wound, and the room went silent. Branded into her skin was a symbol Kalen knew better than his own name, a crescent moon wrapped around a blade, the mark of House Ashgrave, the same symbol that had been carved into the chests of soldiers who never made it home from the war. The same symbol that haunted half the nightmares in his kingdom. The healer looked up at him, unsure what to say. Kalen said nothing. He simply stared at the mark, feeling something cold settle in his stomach, and something else, something warmer and far more stubborn, refused to leave his chest. Word spread through the castle before the woman even opened her eyes. Whispers moved from the healer's wing to the kitchens, to the training yards within the hour. The woman in the west chamber belonged to Ashgrave. She was marked. She was the enemy. Kalen ordered 2 guards posted outside her door and told no one to disturb her rest. Not yet. He needed to think. He needed to understand why, in a war that had cost him nearly everything, his wolf refused to see her as a threat. She woke 2 days later. Kalen was in the hallway when the healer called for him, saying the woman had opened her eyes and was asking, quietly and fearfully, where she was. He entered the room and found her sitting upright, wrapped in a wool blanket, her eyes wide with the kind of fear that could not be faked. She flinched when she saw him, then seemed to steady herself, as if she had trained her whole life not to show weakness in front of powerful men. "Who are you?" Kalen asked, his voice even but firm. "Ilara," she said. Her voice was rough from disuse, but clear. "My name is Ilara. You carry the mark of Ashgrave." Her hand moved instinctively to her shoulder, covering the brand as though she could hide it, now that it had already been seen. "It isn't what you think." "Then tell me what it is." She was quiet for a long moment, studying him, deciding whether he was someone she could trust. Finally she spoke. She told him she had been taken from her family as a child, when she was only 12 years old, as payment for a debt her parents owed to Ashgrave's ruling house. She had grown up inside their walls, not as a daughter, but as a possession, marked to prove she belonged to no one else. She had spent 13 years learning their ways, serving their court, and hating every day of it. 3 nights ago, she said, she had finally run. Kalen listened without interrupting, watching her face for any sign of deception. He had interrogated enemies before. He knew what a lie looked like, the small hesitations, the eyes that would not hold steady. Ilara's eyes held steady the entire time, even as her voice trembled with the weight of what she was confessing. When she finished, he asked only one question: "Why should I believe you?" "You shouldn't," she said. "Not yet, but I am telling you the truth." He left the room without answering her, but his wolf would not settle for the rest of that day. The council convened that evening, and the mood was far less patient than Kalen's had been. His second in command, a broad-shouldered wolf named Draven, who had lost a brother in the war, argued that she should be sent back across the border immediately, before Ashgrave used her as an excuse to invade again. Others agreed. A woman marked by the enemy, found conveniently near their land during a fragile peace, was too dangerous to keep, whatever story she told. Kaelin sat at the head of the table and said little. Part of him understood their fear. He had built Thornvale back up from nothing, stone by stone, and he would not let it fall again because of a stranger's sad story. And yet every instinct in him, the instinct that had kept his people alive for a decade, told him that Alara was not lying. "She stays," he said finally, "under guard, until we know more." Draven did not look pleased, but he did not argue further. No one argued with the Alpha King twice in one evening. Over the following weeks, Alara remained in the castle, watched closely, but treated with a measure of care that surprised even Kaelin. He visited her more than he intended to. He told himself each time that he was gathering information, testing her story for cracks, learning what she knew of Ashgrave's movements that might be useful. But the visits grew longer than they needed to, and the conversations wandered further from strategy than he planned. She was clever, sharper than he expected from someone who had spent her whole life being told she was worth nothing more than a debt. She noticed things about the castle that his own advisors missed, small inefficiencies in the guard rotations, weaknesses in the eastern wall that had gone unaddressed since the war. She spoke of Ashgrave not with loyalty, but with a quiet, controlled anger that only grew stronger the more she trusted him. One evening, as autumn turned the castle gardens gold, Kaelin found her sitting alone by the window in her chamber, staring out at the mountains. "You could have run somewhere else," he said, standing in the doorway. "Somewhere with no history of war with your captors. Why come here?" Alara did not turn around right away. "Because Thornvale was the one place they warned me never to go," she said. "They told me your people would kill me on sight if I ever crossed the border. I suppose part of me wanted to see if that was true. And if it had been? Then at least I would have died free," she said, finally looking at him, "instead of living as someone else's mark." Kaelin said nothing, but something in his chest tightened at the simplicity of her answer. His wolf, restless since the night she arrived, seemed to quiet only when he was near her, as though some ancient part of him had already decided what the rest of him was still working out. The peace did not last. 3 weeks after Alara's arrival, a messenger from Ashgrave rode up to Thornvale's gates under a flag of parley, demanding an audience with the Alpha King. Kaelin received him in the great hall, flanked by his council, with Alara kept out of sight in the west wing under heavy guard. The envoy was a thin, sharp-eyed man named Corvin, who wasted no time stating his purpose. "A woman had deserted House Ashgrave weeks ago," he said, "a woman who belonged to them by mark and by debt. They had reason to believe she had sought shelter within Thornvale's walls. They demanded her immediate return, or they would consider it an act of war." Kaelin kept his expression unreadable, though inside, his wolf had gone rigid with a feeling he did not often allow himself to name: anger. Not at Alara, but at the casual cruelty in Corvin's voice. The way he spoke of a person as though she were nothing more than misplaced property. "And if I refuse," Kaelin said, "then the fragile peace between our packs will not survive the season," Corvin replied. Kaelin thought of the war 10 years ago, of the graves that still marked his territory, of how easily another war could undo everything he had rebuilt, and then he thought of Alara's voice, steady even as she trembled, saying she would rather die free than live as someone else's mark. "There is no woman here who belongs to Ashgrave," Kaelin said finally. "Not anymore." Corvin's eyes narrowed. "You would risk war for a stranger." "I would risk war for what is right," Kaelin answered, and though his voice remained calm, something in the room shifted. Draven, standing nearby, exchanged a glance with the other council members. They had never heard their king speak with such certainty about anyone outside his own pack. Corvin left with a warning that Ashgrave would not accept this answer quietly. That night, scouts reported movement near the eastern border, small groups of Ashgrave soldiers testing the edges of Thornvale's territory, probing for weakness. Kaelin called his council together, along with Alara, whose knowledge of Ashgrave's methods might prove invaluable. She stood before the war table, nervous but resolute, and pointed out the very supply routes and patrol patterns she had learned during her years inside their walls. She knew which paths they would use to strike, which weaknesses in Thornvale's defenses they were most likely to exploit. Draven, who had been the most skeptical of her from the beginning, studied her carefully as she spoke. "Why help us?" he asked. "We are the ones holding you as a prisoner." "You are the first people who ever asked me what I wanted, instead of telling me what I was worth," Ilara said quietly. "I am not helping Thornvale because I owe you loyalty. I am helping because I finally have the chance to fight against the people who marked me, instead of standing silently beside them." No one in the room argued with her after that. The attack came 2 nights later, under cover of darkness, exactly where Ilara had predicted. Thanks to her warning, Kaelin's forces were ready. The battle was short and decisive. Ashgrave's advanced scouts turned back before they could breach the border, their plan unraveling the moment they realized Thornvale already knew their every move. When Kaelin returned to the castle at dawn, exhausted but unharmed, he found Ilara waiting in the courtyard, having refused to sleep until she knew the outcome. Relief broke across her face when she saw him, followed quickly by something she tried, and failed, to hide. "You could have been killed," she said. "So could you, the day you ran," he answered. They stood there for a long moment, neither speaking, the weight of everything that had happened settling quietly between them. The following week, Kaelin called his full council together, along with every member of his household staff, and made an announcement that silenced the Great Hall. The mark on Ilara's shoulder, he declared, held no authority within Thornvale's walls. She was not Ashgrave's possession, not a prisoner, not a bargaining piece to be handed over in exchange for peace. Whatever claim had been branded into her skin as a child was void, effective immediately, under his word as Alpha King. Draven, who had once argued most fiercely against her, was the first to step forward afterward and offer his respect, a quiet acknowledgement of how wrong his fears had been. That evening, Kaelin found Ilara alone in the garden, the same place where he had first heard her speak of choosing freedom over safety. He did not approach with strategy this time, no questions about Ashgrave's movements, no tests of her honesty. He simply stood beside her and told her, plainly, what his wolf had known since the very first night she was carried through his gates. He did not want her to leave. Ilara turned to him, her eyes searching his face for any sign of hesitation, and found none. For the first time since she was 12 years old, someone was asking her to stay, not because she belonged to them, but because she was wanted for exactly who she was. "I am not marked anymore," she said softly, "not by them." "No," Kaelin agreed, "you never truly were." She reached up and touched the scar on her shoulder, the brand that had once defined her entire life, and for the first time, it felt like nothing more than an old wound, finally beginning to heal. Ilara stayed, not as a prisoner, not as a debt to be paid, but as someone who had finally, after 13 long years, chosen exactly where she belonged. And within the walls of Thornvale Castle, where a king's wolf had once refused to let her leave, she found something she never expected to find again: a home,